All right, happy. Yeah. For some reason, I've also lost my rhythm. This is in context to the mood when you're talking about, if you take a break from YouTube for a little bit, like you kind of lose your rhythm. I know. I think my last two videos I posted have been like kind of little like notes, little sketch notes. Um, it's just been like little quick philosophical ideas to kind of explain and think through. But so today we're going to talk about Hegelian cliche. What is the perfect Hegelian cliche? And I was, because I recently just got out of the book club with the Wood and so on. And we are talking about cliches and we are talking about bad reasons. Um, and we were talking, and Chris made a really good point, one of the members in the book club, about that cliches are in some sense always inadequate. But I think cliches are, in some sense, the most. They have such a perfect Hegelian encounter with reality. And to make this point, I think the most perfect cliche for Hegel, the most perfect Hegelian cliche is time heals all wounds. The reason why I like this cliche is because people know immediately, in some sense, that's not true. Time does not heal all wounds, right? Um, but there's another thing that needs to happen to where you realize that actually the cliche is ironically true. Why? Because in order for you to say that the cliche time heals all wounds is not true, the very thing that you needed to say this was time. And so what happens is that you discover via time that time healing all wounds is not true, right? But again, the other layer to this is that it's your notion of being it's your notion of being cured from something that is also ironically works against the cliche of time heals all wounds. Why? Because, and the reason why I think time heals all wounds is the perfect Hegelian cliche is because time, eventually through time, you discover that even your notion of being healed or your notion of wound is also ironically the cure, right? It's also the very thing that, in some sense, sustains you. And it's funny because if you go into what do we mean by cure, like cure implies some type of finality to things. But if you're thinking, let's think about the body and its atomic atomic uh, anatomic functionality, right? Like the biological functions, right? The reason why we want a cure or we look for a cure for the body, if there's a kind of ailment, is typically that there's a dysfunction, right? That there's a function, like there's something that's not functioning properly, right? Scientifically, we say there's something not functioning properly, so you're sick, and so on, right? What's interesting about that is that actually the notion of fever, the notion of having a fever, is actually how the body attempts to get rid of the virus, right? But what's funny is that we think that having a fever is a kind of dysfunction. So we're like, oh, let me take medication to bring down the fever. Now, the reason why the fever can become dangerous is because if the fever doesn't get rid of it, it can continue increasing the temperature, and eventually you can have brain damage and so on and so on. So there's definitely a limit to the functionality of the fever, but typically we think the fever in itself is a dysfunction, right? But actually that's not true. The notion of a fever is not a dysfunction. It's precisely, it's a dysfunction meant to reintegrate the functionality back again, right? And this is what we would call like homeostasis, essentially. So the reason why I go back to this notion of time heals all wounds, right? If you think about a wound, or we think, okay, a wound is some type of uh, opening, right? Some type of opening as such. But the reason why I like the concept of wound is because you needed the idea that you could be cured, that time heals all wounds, to discover that actually the wound itself is what kind of tricked you into the finality of discovering that there is some type of cure. When in fact it was the wound itself that was the cure, because you wouldn't have been then be able to even pursue the idea that, or the possibility that there could be a cure. And so also ironically, you needed time to discover this. So wound and time become intimately linked together, right? And it's interesting that we typically know that wounds heal over time, right? That's sort of like the actual process. Wounds do actually heal over time. If we're talking about physical, um, our physical bodies, the wounds do actually heal over time. But you see, what is more ironic about that is that the wound doesn't need a cure. You understand what I'm saying? Is like, if you ever actually had a wound before, all the wound demands is that you take care of it, which is an indicator of time. You need time to take care of the wound. If you take care of the wound heals itself. That's how our body works. So this notion that time heals all wounds, you start discovering that actually now, once you start pressing into these wounds, the wound heals itself. Now, here's the meta skill that I haven't addressed, right? What do people really mean then? Because we're not talking about a physical wound, because a physical wound, like I said before, actually, for the most part, take care of itself. And even if a wound doesn't take care of itself, you taking care of the wound allows the wound to take care of itself. That's the only reason why we have to take care of wounds, is because sometimes the wound cannot take care of itself. The body cannot take care of the wound by itself. So you have to do some extra things to take care of the wound. But ultimately, you never heal the wound. It's just the wound already, the the notion of wound already implies healing, already implies some type of closing eventually, right? It's kind of like when you get cut, right? The idea is that actually eventually the cut will close itself, right? Unless some type of infection happens or something like that. The concern about the wound is actually something gets in the wound. And this is anatomically and biologically, or this is like the pathology of the wound, really, is that something gets in the wound. And what you're doing is you're trying to prevent something from getting in the wound, because fundamentally, if something gets into the wound can't heal itself. It can make you more sick. So it's ironic to me that the notion of wound is about making sure that nothing gets into the wound. But there's something to that line of logic that we do to ourselves psychologically, meaning that sometimes the wound is about its persistence to remain open. But its persistence to remain open is precisely why it heals. The concern is actually when something gets into the wound that it does not, in some sense, heal because it's preventing its natural function. But just to go back to the real main point here is that when people obsess over this cliche of time heals all wounds, they're typically referring to psychological wounds, some type of psychological wounding, right? Like a heartbreak or something like that, right? Where we are begging, right? We are begging in almost the most perverse sense to get rid of the pain and the suffering of this psychological wound. And so that's why the cliche time heals all wounds is annoying too, because we know immediately that cliche is insufficient to say that to somebody that is currently suffering, that is currently going through something. Like there seems to be no real guarantee that actually time will heal my wound. Um, and this is why I say that time heals all wounds is almost like the perfect Hegelian cliche, because what ends up happening is that time heals all wounds is that in the context of real time, if you just grant me that word, meaning like just the continuance of time, the persistence of time, um, allows you to discover that whatever notion of time that you're having is inadequate, and then whatever notion of wound you're having is inadequate. And this goes back to like Hegel's whole like nature nurture, like or notion and nature, right? Or like notion and nature, like nature changes notion, notion changes nature, and then this goes back and forth, right? What's interesting, why I like the time heals all wounds, is that through the givenness of real time, the amount of span of time for this cliche to understand itself is that your understanding of time heals all wounds ends up changing given the nature of time and given the nature of wound, because it challenges your notion of wound, challenges your notion of time, given within the span of your real time and real wound. And so they kind of feed into each other. But what ends up happening is that you end up getting a whole different kind of cliche, even though it's the same cliche, right? The idea that time heals all wounds. Um, the reason why, again, this cliche is inadequate is because you discover that time doesn't heal all wounds. But what's ironic is that you needed time to discover that notion, right? But then you also needed time to discover that your concept of wound never needed healing in the first place. That actually, if I give like a kind of metaphorical or example of like our anatomic bodies of wounds, the concern about the wound is not the fact that it's open. Well, I take that back. The concern about the wound is not because it's a wound. The concern about the wound, at least in healthcare reasons, is that something can get inside the wound. And the reason why you're always concerned about something getting inside the wound is because if something gets inside the wound, it can get infected and the wound never heals. In fact, it exacerbates, basically, right? So if you look at the context of time heals all wounds, people think, okay, I'm going to try to do something to close the wound, right? That eventually the wound heals. But actually, what is problematic about the cliche is that the subject doesn't understand. It's not about obsessing over when will my wound heal. It's about the constant vigilance, about making sure nothing gets inside the wound. Because once something gets inside the wound, that's when you could say, biologically and pathologically, the pathology of the wound is that if something gets inside the wound, it gets infected and the whole body can shut down. You can go into sepsis. It goes into extreme health measures. But of course, typically when people talk about wounds, they're not talking about physical wounds. They're talking about psychological wounds. But I think there can be a parallel drawn between psychological wounds and physical wounds. Because if you think about the real material reality of a wound, is that the wound is in some sense already beginning to heal. The problematic nature of the wound is precisely because it's open. Something can get inside of it. It's not that it's not going to heal. It will heal over time. That's sort of like the given functionality of the wound. But it's the vulnerability of the wound, of it being susceptible to infection, that it can prevent us from whatever notion of healing that we're talking about. But basically, what I'm saying is that obsessing over healing is not really the point of the wound. The wound is already implies healing. Um, what's problematic again is the fact that it's open. And so the notion of time heals all wounds, I would say that yes, that's true. However, you need to believe in this inadequacy to discover that it's not true, right? But then precisely the failure of the cliche is actually the failure of your notion about time and wound, right? For which, when you discover the failure of your own notions concerning time and wound, given the span of actual time, do you then discover that time heals all wounds? That's why I like time heals all wounds is like the perfect Hegelian cliche for me. Because, one, it kind of plays with Hegel's kind of like historical progress, unfolding, sublation, so on and so on, to realize that, notion, nature, and, notion changes nature, nature changes notion. But I really like the play on the fact that you need time to discover that time doesn't heal all wounds, but then you discover that actually it was the inadequacy of your own notion of time and wounds that retroactively sublimate your own notion of time and wounds, to then discover that actually time does heal all wounds. Because the reason why time heals all wounds is because time, given through the context of time, time will always challenge your own notion of time and wound. And so in some sense, yes, time heals all wounds, but you have to make sure that nothing gets in the wound, because then it never allows you the possibility of changing your notion of time and nature, of time and wound. So it's more about the constant vigilance of not letting something get into the wound, which can prevent the sublation of something else. But yeah, that's really all I want to say. I feel like this is just like a bullshit video. Because I just want to talk about Hegelian cliche. But yeah, that's really it. That's all I had to say about this. I mean, maybe it's significant for some people, but I really think I just did this for just, shits and giggles, to kind of make a point, or make a pointless point. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully I explained myself. I know I never explained myself adequately, but hopefully just enough, given the context of my audience that I usually have, which is the people that I typically interact with. I don't think you guys will have a problem understanding, but there's always that chance. But anyways, I hope you guys did understand, and yeah, all right, take care.